You have a terrifically interesting panel here. You have this afternoon addressing resource volatility, addressing our attempt to know the unknowns. And a strange group, really. You have an admiral who has actually taken charge of an aircraft carrier, probably the greatest living guru in terms of financial thinking, and particularly financial thinking in the area of resources, and a man who's not just run the world's largest brewer, but now bottles what is the most popular drink to human beings everywhere, namely Coca-Cola. And so I feel as though we've got one of the beginnings of one of those jokes, you know, what happens when the Englishman, the Irishman, and the Frenchman meet. I don't know what happens when the admiral, the financier, and the bottler meet, but over the next 50 minutes we're going to find out. My job is to be a hardball moderator, by which I mean I will keep each of these very impressive gentlemen to their 10 minutes. They're going to present to you for 10 minutes first. I will then abuse my position for a few minutes, ask them each a few questions, kickstart a conversation, but of course most importantly is your engagement in this conference today. So please feel free to line up questions and comments, and we'll get to those at the end. It's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Rear Admiral Neil Morisetti. I think I can safely say he's the only person in the room today who's run his own aircraft carrier. And I know we're amongst people who run big ships, but Neil, you've run a real big ship. The really interesting thing that that Neil Morisetti has done in the last few years is to have been commandeered not just by the Department of Defense, but also by the Foreign Office and the Department of Environment and Climate Change, and to try and look at what are the impacts of what's happening in the world of resources on Britain's national security and security everywhere. Rear Admiral Neil Morisetti.
James, thank you very much. I suppose the answer to the question is the bottler provides it, the financier pays for it, the admiral drinks it, and the journalist writes about drunken naval officer. This morning, we've heard about the challenges that we face in achieving secure, sustainable, and affordable supplies of key natural resources, which are essential for economic growth and prosperity. And we've heard about that complex relationship between food, water, and energy, made more complex by the impact of climate change. But what the devil has that got to do with the military? And why have you got an admiral standing here? Surely this is about science, it's about economics, it's about business, it's about social issues. Well, clearly it is all of those. But I would suggest because of that complex nexus, it's also about potential issues of global stability or instability. What it's not about is the military trying to take over, about militarizing this issue. Nor, as was suggested yesterday in Brussels, is it a cunning plan to recover some of those cutbacks in defence spending that have been happening in a number of our countries over the last few years. But we have a remit in the military in all countries, not just to look at the issues and the challenges and threats to our national stability and national security today, but also to put the headlights on full beam, to look over the horizon, to see what's coming, and see how we can reduce the risks in that point. And as David Richards, the Chief of Defence Staff, said at the end of last year, his biggest concern about national security was whether or not the economy would recover from the economic downturn. So what does it mean for us? I think it means three things. It's an issue of strategic analysis, the context in which we're considering this. It's about what does it mean for the work we're going to do, the tasks and missions we're going to perform, and it's about how we're doing it and with what kit we're doing it and who we're doing it with. The 21st century was promised to be a quiet century. The first decade or so has proved us wrong. And we face a number of challenges. Some of those are legacy challenges from the 20th century, some are new ones. Cyber is an example, there are others as well. And the impact of climate change is part of that process. We need to understand the context. We need to understand that relationship, that nexus between food, water, energy, and climate change. And if you take a map of the world, if you look at where global stress exists today, it's an equatorial belt either side, meso, South America, through Africa, through Asia, and out to the Pacific. It's about food shortages, about water shortages, health problems, demographic challenges. It's where we've seen conflict in the past, between countries, within countries. It's where governments do not necessarily have the capacity and resilience to look after their citizens. It's where the greatest effects of climate change will be. Now, that's not to say that it's likely climate change is going to start a conflict in itself. The causes of conflict are many and complex. But it will act as an exacerbator or a threat multiplier to those stresses, particularly if you look at the second and third order consequences. What happens when you lose your land or your livelihood? Where could you go? Can you go anywhere? What alternative livelihoods are available? Are they legitimate or are they illegal? And it affects all of us, because as we've heard this morning, we live in a globalized world. The Thai floods is a very good example. Another element of that, Swindon, Honda, production lines slowed down because components couldn't come out of Thailand. There are many other examples of that interconnected world, which means it affects us here in Europe as much as it affects those people who directly feel the direct impact at this stage. That sort of analysis needs to be done, enough to allow us to determine priorities. Priorities for action, priorities between threats. What we do not need is 100% certainty. If we waited for 100% certainty on many other threats, certainly on the battlefield, we'd be dead. We know enough to know we need to do something. So what does it mean in the way of missions and tasks for the military? We talked about extreme weather events, an increased frequency of that, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, that sort of first aid, band-aid type disaster relief assistance. But perhaps more importantly, it's about building and helping to build, as one of many actors, and in many ways a small part actor, amongst other government departments and non-government organisations, help build capacity and resilience in those countries so they can deal with these challenges that are presented by the food, water, energy stresses. It's about helping coast guards deliver the capability to look after their own waters. We talk a lot about piracy in the Horn of Africa. Bottom of the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, bottom of the Red Sea. You don't need to buy an outboard to be a pirate there. It's only 7 miles to the shipping lane. You can row out and do it. You're coming from the Yemen, a country severely affected by all these issues. The problems are going to be more compounded in the future. We need to help them to manage that water, that exclusive economic zone, the fishery and the resources that are found there. But as I say, it's a small part. As far as the UK is concerned, from the military, it's part of a wider piece of work, building stability overseas, released by our government, signed by Defence Secretary, Foreign Secretary, and the Secretary for International Development. Part of a cross-government approach. This is not something you can deal with in individual stovepipes. We need to have the right kit to do these tasks. The military will always need a hard-edged warfighting capability, whatever country we come from. But we will also need the right equipment and the right notice availability to do some of the tasks I've just described. We need the right skill sets from our people. We need to be able to work with different organisations. When I joined the Navy, it was very easy. We were a military alliance of 12, one threat. I worked with other navies. My job was to help with all the other naval officers get stuff from America to Europe, while the guys on the ground held a defensive line against the Warsaw Pact. Today, it's much more complex. And it's more complex, not just because of the threats, but the people we have to work with, the different types of organisations, and this is another example of that where we need to address it. And we need to be sustainable in delivering our outputs. The military have always been heavy users of energy. Napoleon, it was fodder. Patton broke out of Normandy, raced across France, logistics failed to keep up, not enough fuel, he had to stop. Today, we use 22 gallons per man per day on average on operations. A lot of that is because we're much more technical than we were in World War II when we used 1 gallon per man per day, but it's going that way. You've heard about the aircraft carrier. Anyone like to hazard a guess at how much one careful driver can extract from a gallon of fuel for a British aircraft carrier? Maybe I'm not a careful driver, but when I'm launching and recovering jets, I was getting 12 inches to the gallon. You can do that at $30 a barrel. You cannot do it at $150 a barrel. More importantly, it was a critical vulnerability. I needed a floating petrol station. I had to protect that petrol station. And every third or fourth day, I was topping up the tanks, and I wasn't launching and recovering jets, which was my raison d'etre. And that's before you even think about what's coming out of the funnel. It's the same today in Afghanistan. American forces, British forces, many other forces operating in Afghanistan. We took 120 million litres of fuel into Afghanistan in 2010, most of it on a road from Karachi into Helmand province. It had to be protected. It constrained the way we did our business. It tied people down. We took casualties. In America, they've done some work. I think it's every 24th convoy there's a casualty. It was disrupted. The borders only just reopened after nearly 7 months of being closed. And the cost, well, people bandy about figures, $400 a gallon. That's an extreme, but it's at least 10 times the pump price. Our business model doesn't work in that sense. We in the military have to have an energy plan, whether it's US military forces, UK military forces, or other nations. One that recognizes we need to improve our outputs, be more effective, we need to reduce our risks, and we need to reduce our costs. And we can do that by changing our behavior. If you get kit in the military, if it's big, it comes with a diesel generator. If it's small, it comes with a battery. The big ones, we were running and powering with diesel generators on half load. Well, even I, a gunnery officer, knows that 2 powered off 1 is more cost effective than 2 generators running. So we need to change our behavior. We need to exploit technology. We need to exploit other types of fuel. For example, US Marine Corps, Helmand Province, charging batteries, using roll-out solar blankets, photovoltaic cells. No need for diesel generators. Not only is it saving fuel, moving fuel around, but we're more effective doing our job because you haven't got this generator humming around in the background, giving away your position, and disturbing your noise patterns. And as I said, we need to work on technology. And we need to think about it today and tomorrow. But that business model, which gives us the right capabilities, and at the end of the day, we must have the right capabilities to do the job we need to do, and if there's a trade-off, that's the priority, is about improved outputs, less risk, less cost. Now, I suggest that's a business model that goes wider than just defense. But very briefly to sum up, because I realize I'm running out of time, and in a sense, I'm going to reinforce and reaffirm some of the things that you've heard this morning about what we need to achieve what I'm talking about. We need to recognize there's a challenge. There's another issue out there. It's about global prosperity. It's about global stability. We need to acknowledge that the existing ways of dealing with things may not be appropriate today. Institutions, national institutions, international institutions need to evolve to meet the challenges of the 21st century. The traditional stovepipes we perhaps operated in governments, etc., we need to become more horizontal, more cross-government. The fact that I'm working for 3 departments is perhaps indicative of that sort of thing, but it's much wider than that. International institutions need to evolve as well. We need new business models. It's as much about public-private sector, national, international, as it is just one country or one organization. And we need a strategic narrative or story that explains to people why we need to do this, and more importantly, where the opportunities are. It needs to be in a language people can understand. The messenger needs to be someone who's relevant, they can have an affinity with, and they can understand that message. So ultimately, although I've talked about these issues from a security perspective, the solution is not a security solution, but it's one that involves all of us. It requires leadership from all of us at all levels. Thank you very much.
Admiral Morisetti, thank you very much indeed. I think to introduce Jeremy Grantham to a room full of financial investors and some of the world's leading environmental policymakers, it feels a little like showing up in Omaha and saying, let me tell you a little bit about Warren Buffett. You know who Jeremy Grantham is. He runs one of the most successful fund management groups in the world, and most importantly, he's become probably the leading financial thinker on resource scarcity. Jeremy Grantham.
Thank you. Sitting here today reminds me that given any chance at all, one tries to put a positive spin on things. It's the same in the NGO world. Well, to be clear, I'm a glass is 3/4 empty person, okay? And a cheerful pessimist. Yes, on paper, we can do everything, we can do it well, but we won't. Because of politics, because of vested interests, because of short-termism, and because of inertia. But we can obviously stop our population at 10 billion, but that is already far above the carrying capacity of the planet, which may be, in the long run, 3, 4, 5 billion, perhaps even less. So I'm bearish on human outcomes, and unfortunately, in a way, rather bullish on resource investments. Just a quick warning on economists in this field. The OECD environmental group, by the way, unofficially say that they cannot find an economic theory that usefully treats the finiteness of resources. And better yet, Kenneth Boulding said, anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. Let me start with recommendations for once and work backwards. Any serious investor, those with a 10-year horizon, should allocate a large percentage of their portfolio to resources and resource efficiency. I recommend at least 30%, which is about 2.25 times the market weight. Even more important, though, is to recognize the vulnerability of all the other traditional investments as the resource shortages begin to squeeze the profit margin, the growth rate itself. Exhibit 1, let's see if that works. Exhibit 1, first of all, this shows the declining price of commodities for the 100 years. And this shows the declining relative performance of mining stocks and a few others thrown in. You can see it's a pretty decent relationship. And then we get to the great paradigm shift as resource prices leap upwards in 2002, and that is what happens to the stocks. The relationship there is 0.52. For other commodities, it's about 0.3. So if you believe, as I do, that resource prices are going up, you can be reasonably certain you will do very well in outperforming in resource stocks. This is the thing we did a year ago, which caused a stir. We created our own equal weighted index of 33 commodities. They declined for 100 years. They lost 70% of their value. And then without any defining event, without any fuss, they gave it all back. They tripled in the last 10 years. An amazing paradigm shift, probably the most important thing since the Industrial Revolution. And this is McKinsey's version. Different weighting system completely, but it bottoms in 2001 and goes to a new high. The reasons are pretty clear. Population growth and China. And whenever you see a chart like this, you should be disturbed. It used to double every 1,000 years. It tripled in my lifetime. The Chinese consumption in this last explosive 20 years has ended up, for the less far-sighted, they use 59% of every bag of cement used on the planet, 48% of every ton of coal, 48% of every ton of iron ore. These are incredible numbers. With the population growing in absolute terms as fast as it ever did, combined with this growth, you could see how quickly the pressure would be so severe on resources that the old days would be gone forever. Before I move on, I'd like to tell you what I do with my 30% in my foundation. I have allocated 15% to forestry and farmland, which is my favorite now, 10% in resources in the ground, never in futures, and 5% in efficiency plays. I also recommend averaging in. The volatility is, of course, enormous, and the price can come down in the short term, but in the long run, you can't afford to miss this opportunity. Running out of cheap hydrocarbons is a great problem in the short term, but longer term, technology can provide us with sufficient renewable energy, although at a high capital cost. And we've heard a lot about that, so I'll skip over it. Metals, in their way, are less tractable even than energy, and less appreciated as a problem. Entropy is absolutely merciless, and even if you recycle 80, 90%, and even if you take your physical growth down to zero, metals are still slipping slowly through our fingers. The better behaved we are, the more slowly they will disappear, and the more slowly the price will rise. The real problem, of course, is food. Water problems we've heard about, an increasingly destabilizing factor. We will be very lucky if it doesn't cause wars. 300 million Chinese and Indians are actually fed by overwatering. They and maybe another 100 million will eventually be thrown back on already overstressed surface water. For developed countries, however, I conclude, in terms of the big picture, the water problems are mostly self-inflicted, horrible mispricing, and amazing wastage that approaches 50%. We live, after all, on a very watery planet. The water problems are really for several poorer countries for which their problem is more intractable. Erosion of our land has through history cost us about a third of all the arable land over several thousand years. We lose about 1% of our soil, 100 times replacement cost. It can be stopped by no-till farming, but it's under 10% today, and if we delay, it eats into our long-term capability. Worst of all is fertilizer. Potassium and phosphorus are vital elements. You cannot make them, you can't substitute for them. They're mined and depleted and are exceptionally unequally distributed. Morocco has a staggering 85% of all high-grade phosphorus. They're price setters already, and in 30 years, they could be the greatest near monopoly in the history of the world. Fertilizer is up 5-fold in 50 years. It's reaching a maximum useful intensity beyond which it causes damage. Organic farming may well address this problem, but organic farming is only under 1% today. Organic farming uses these critical fertilizers much more frugally. The growth in productivity of grains has fallen from 3.5% in the Green Revolution to 1.2% today, which is exactly the same rate as the growth of population. And into this tight equation, you've heard about the growing middle class who wants to eat meat. 1 pound of dressed beef displaces 30 pounds of grain. In fact, the limits to grain productivity may be approaching, just as horses that have been bred for 5,000 years don't run any faster today than they did in the 1920s. Some very productive countries in wheat and in rice have not made any progress for over 10 years. The climate instability we have not heard, I think, enough about. It's already creating problems, unprecedented droughts and floods, but by 2100, the sheer temperature increase will make a ruinous 1/3 to 2/3 drop in grain production. And do not be tempted to think that climate claims are exaggerated. As scientists have been consistently behind the curve. The melting of the northern ice has now reached levels that 20 years ago were predicted for 2050. Scientists, with a few invaluable, brave exceptions, are terrified of being seen to exaggerate or to court publicity, which are both cardinal academic crimes. It is underestimating, though, in this unique case that it is dangerous. Anytime we could see a chain-linked acceleration of methane from tundra or frozen undersea deposits, and almost all climate scientists know that the risk is very much higher than generally accepted or than they are loudly claiming. We're living a dangerous life of denial and understatement. In 200 years, with the kind of modest improvements we're getting from business and government, our planet will literally be toast. As a sneak preview, this is the 3rd consecutive year of truly ridiculous global weather. It was a 1 in 150-year event 2 years ago, a 1 in a 50-year event last year, and this year is beginning to seem just as bad. To summarize, developed countries can adopt policies that will moderate long-term pressure on resource prices, especially for energy. But in general, it will be too political, too tough, opposed by hydrocarbon interests and a general public that desperately prefers to hear good news. In acting slowly, developed countries are inadvertently pushing poor countries into malnutrition, starvation, and for prices will do the rationing, and that is already 5 years into the game. It will create internal stability, mass migrations, destabilizing global politics. Food in the developed world is about 10% of our budget, but in North Africa, let's say Egypt, it's about 40%. The price of food in the UN Food Index tripled between 2002 and 2011, if it were in the last 10 years. If it were to even double in the next 20 years, you can work out the consequences for Egypt, starting at 40%. It has $5 billion trade deficit, rapidly growing 82 million people, 2/3 only fed internally. Who will pay for the extra food? I believe nobody. Our complete indifference is illustrated brilliantly in the US by the use of our maize the world's largest crop of maize, for ethanol as a subsidy for already rich farmers. A single tankful of a 4x4 or an SUV, if it were filled with pure ethanol, uses enough calories to feed one Indian farmer for 1 year. Finally, as wishful thinking about Hitler began to break down in the 1930s, Churchill once said, quote, "The era of procrastination, of half measures, of delays is coming to its close. In its place, we are entering the period of consequences." And so we are today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, for a fascinating speech and, if I may say, quite a good Churchill impression. Ladies and gentlemen, our third speaker is John Brock. He has done pretty much every interesting job there is to do through Cadbury Schweppes, InBev, and now running Coca-Cola Enterprises, the bottler of Coca-Cola and so many other drinks. Ladies and gentlemen, John Brock.
Very good. Thank you, and it's great to be here. We lived in London for 7 years, Brussels for 3, and it's always terrific to be here in Europe. Just to say a couple of things up front about who we are and the difference between us and Coke. The Coca-Cola Company is all about the consumer connection, advertising, branding, and the brand name. And bottlers around the world like us manufacture and distribute products to customers. So the way to think about it, Coca-Cola consumers, bottlers, customers. So our principal activities are with major customers like Tesco, Sainsbury, Carrefour, and we are the largest and most strategic bottler for Coca-Cola products in Western Europe. Sustainability is absolutely at the heart of everything we do. We view ourselves as a growth company, but in a very low carbon, zero waste profile. We don't make a decision at our company, whether it's a marketing investment or a capital investment or any other kind of decision, without thinking about sustainability. I'd like to just talk briefly on risks, opportunities, and leadership. Risks. As you've just heard, we clearly live in a world with a lot of uncertainty and a lot of risk. Macroeconomic issues, supply chain issues, commodities, severe weather conditions, all contribute to instability. For us, trying to manage these risks is really important. Certainly on the commodities front, we have a very sophisticated procurement and finance organization which engages in long supplier contracts, as well as fairly sophisticated hedging, which does a reasonable job of smoothing some of the cost. It doesn't solve the problem, though. It is a major issue. And I have to say that as we think about opportunities, one of the things that we think is at the very heart and soul of opportunities is sustainability. We have had it at the heart of our business for the past 6 years. Our vision is deliver for today and inspire for tomorrow. We have 3 major environmental components and 4 major social components. I'd like to just briefly talk on the 3 environmental ones. One is, by 2020, we have said we will reduce the carbon footprint of the beverage in my hand by 1/3. That's a massive statement. And just to put in perspective, last year, we sold 3.5% more volume in Western Europe and reduced our carbon footprint 8.5%. Water. Water is near and dear to everything we do, clearly on a worldwide basis as well as on a Western European basis. We are the most efficient user of water in the Coca-Cola system. We're now down under 1.4 liters for each liter of product that we sell. The way we do that is investing in ways of reducing water. And our goal long-term is to actually get to 1:1. The only way we can do that, we think we can get down to about 1.1 or 1.15 in our system, and the rest of it will have to be done through water replenishment projects. And for example, we have a number of those going, several even here in Great Britain. And finally, packaging. Third environmental issue is packaging. We have committed by 2020 that we will either recycle or reuse 100% of the packaging that we produce. This is a massive challenge, but one that we're committed to work through, particularly with governments and other organizations, to achieve. Plastic reduction. We've reduced the amount of plastic in this bottle by over 30% over the last 10 years, working hand in hand with our suppliers. Plant bottle, up to 30% of the plastic in most of our bottles in Western Europe today comes from non-petroleum sources, comes from biomass, typically from molasses. And our goal long-term is for that to be 100%. We'd like to reduce our dependency, obviously, on petroleum. And then finally, we just invested 15 million pounds in a joint venture with Ecoplastics here to put in place a state-of-the-art plastics reprocessing facility. And just to put in perspective what that's going to do, when you visit the Olympics, or when you see the Olympics on television, every single bottle there will be recycled, will be reprocessed, and will appear back on a store shelf within 6 weeks. And that's because of this new factory that we have just installed. These are some of the things that we're trying to do and are committed to do on a sustainability basis. Let me wrap up my comments by saying simply, in our view, leadership, individual leadership by companies, by businesses, and ultimately by CEOs, and importantly, by government, is what it's all about. The old ways of leading are not sufficient. We need to do what's right for the planet because it's also right for business. We at CCE are committed to provide that leadership. Thank you very much.
John, thank you very much, and all lovers of Coca-Cola will be actually really quite encouraged and inspired by the idea of seeing a bottle back on the shelves in 6 weeks. Absolutely amazing. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to have a quick talk with these three. As you'd expect of a newspaper person, I spend my life straddling old-fashioned and newfangled ways of doing things, and the same is true today. So the way we're going to run questions and comments is, if you've got them, please feel free to feed them through via those iPods and into this iPad, and I'm happy to put questions and even pointed ones to our panelists. If you want to just stick up your hand and say something, please do. I wanted to just start by asking a quick question to all, to each one of you, and I was going to start, if I may, with Admiral Morisetti. I guess everyone will be impressed by the idea that the world's military thinkers are beginning to feed in resource scarcity and its impact in terms of their military planning. I just wondered how thin you think that thinking is. The question I had was, one of the most striking things we discovered during the Arab Spring was that 34,000 Chinese people lived in Libya. And clearly, the spread of Chinese people is following the search for resources, and that will change the way in which the Chinese deploy their military assets. Do you think that the way in which the United Kingdom or the US or other European nations are thinking about their deployment of assets is closely following that whole issue of resource scarcity and the China's militarization?
I don't think necessarily the way the United Kingdom deploys people mirrors what China is doing, but I think we're increasingly understanding, and that doesn't mean we know enough yet. I think we recognise we need to know more, not just in this country, but other countries in Europe, further afield, America, to understand what those implications are about resource scarcity and what it means about population movements. Because yes, I think when we look at the number of people who were found in Libya, it was quite a surprise to everybody. The 2010 National Security Strategy, Strategic Defence and Security Review started to look at these areas, informed by some work done by our Development and Concepts and Doctrine Centre at Srivenham, as they look ahead to the world of 2040 and global strategic trends. Similar work's been done in America in the Quadrennial Defence Review, but I think since then, and because of events like Libya and other things, we're beginning to realise that this has got to come higher up the priority. So as we prepare for the 2015 Strategic Defence Security Review, already we're starting to do, okay, so what's changed? What changed because of what we saw there in other events as well, as we've seen with commodity prices, the effects of it? How does that affect our business? And recognising that again, as I mentioned, I don't think it can sit in a neat silo of this is defence or even this is security. It's much wider, and therefore how we're going to adapt and evolve to meet not just the challenges, but the manner in which we meet those challenges.
Very interesting. Jeremy Grantham, actually listening to you speak, I realised that to a certain extent, you're not greatly concerned by resource volatility. You can see, actually, resource scarcity is a pretty predictable thing. In your comments, though, you made one really fascinating remark that of the 30% that you recommend people allocate for resource investment, your favorite within that sector is farmland. I'd just be interested to know why it's farmland and which, if you like, is your least favorite.
The weakness with an oil company or a copper company is, although they have assets that are going up in price, which is great and will make you money, they have to replace those assets or eventually they go out of business. As the upward pressure on resources continues, though, think of the advantages of a farmer. He is not having to replace his basic asset. If he nurtures it well, his asset is forever, and the price of land will go up along with the price of corn, which is exactly what's been happening. So that is at the top of the tree, with maybe forestry thrown in also at the top of the tree.
And the bottom of the tree being?
The bottom of the tree, things that run out very quickly, and therefore you have to scramble around to replace them. But that is in the resource group, which is highly thought of. The really bottom of the tree is more or less everything else. And within the everything else, I would stick with high quality, high return companies, which will be more resilient in the times of stress that I see coming, and perhaps an overweight in Brazil, which I heard good things about this morning, of course.
Certainly. John Brock, it's very striking what you've done in 6 years at Coca-Cola Enterprises. The question people have when they see individuals come in and seek to transform companies and company behavior around sustainability is that that itself is not sustainable, is that that's being driven by a person at the top, an individual's agenda. How do you take a big company like yours and make sure that actually the change you're talking about comes from the bottom up?
Well, clearly, without a CEO who's committed, I'll admit it's difficult. But what we've done over the past 6 years is we've embedded a CRS governance model into the company, which I think, frankly, would be very difficult to go away from. We are, only 20% of Fortune 500 companies in the United States have a CRS board committee. We've had one for the past 6 years. We have a CRS advisory council, which has over 100 members, which meets regularly, and I chair it. We have found that the single most important driver of employee engagement is leadership at the company, and number two is sustainability. So basically, we've embedded it in the governance model. I cannot imagine, regardless of who succeeded me as CEO, that would change, because it is so much a part of the DNA of the company.
And do you think people, your customers, appreciate what you're doing? Neil Morisetti said right at the beginning that we've got a communications issue. People need to understand what needs to be done and what is actually happening. Do you think consumers of Coca-Cola and other drinks are aware of what's happening?
I think consumers care. I think, frankly, more importantly, our customers care, and we make sure that our suppliers care. Our major customers in the United Kingdom, Tesco, for example, is again a very leading proponent of sustainability. Asda, which is owned by Walmart, again, very, very focused. And we've now, for 4 years, gone to our suppliers, and we've said to them, it used to be price, quality, and service, and guess what? It's those three, but the starting one is sustainability, and if you don't do what we want you to do, whether you're a sugar supplier or an aluminum supplier, if you don't do what we want you to do on sustainability and help us, and you help us improve your sustainability profile, you won't be a supplier regardless of the other three.
Great.
30 seconds on that. Harvard Business School, of all places, did a recent survey of companies that had scored the highest over the last 20 years, and to their surprise and everybody else's, over 20 years, they did better in everything. They had better profit margins, they did better in growth, and they won in the stock market by more than 2% a year. So that's pretty encouraging.
And we totally agree with you. You're absolutely right. But just to be clear, the one group that I still don't think quite gets it are consumers. And we've got to educate them and make sure they understand just how important it is. And recycling is a good example of that. US and UK, we have got to get recycling rates up. And frankly, at the end of the day, it's getting consumers to be concerned about it.
I'm about to come to you, so straight away. The one rather sensible thing about this system is it enables people to ask questions which they may not want to be seen to ask, but would nevertheless like to ask. And so I've been asked here to put this question to you, John Brock, which I rather like the ginger of it. It says, look, it's all very impressive doing your 30%, but when you listen to what Jeremy Grantham said, isn't it the case that actually you're lowballing your target on emissions, and you should be aiming for something much higher, like 80%?
Well, we've changed the target now 3 times in the last 6 years. We've consistently gotten more aggressive. We'll continue to do that. We don't know today, even remotely, how we're going to reduce our carbon footprint in this package, in this product, by 1/3. But we're committed to doing it, and frankly, I think each year you're going to see us go after it.
I guess the point that's made is you'll hit your target because somehow targets have a way of being achieved. And should you be aiming for a target that is considerably greater on your carbon footprint than 30%?
Well, I think we will, but frankly, I think the idea that you put a target out there that is so audacious that you say there's no chance of getting it, that just doesn't make sense. I think it's what you should say is, here's where we know we can get, let's double it, right, for example, and then let's go after that. And frankly, that's much more reasonable.
There's a man whose arm's going to come out of his socket. So let me just this gentleman here.
Forgive me, I think it's an important issue. My name is Paul Dickinson from Carbon Disclosure Project. And there is a definition of sustainability, which is a really big problem that the government can't fix. Jeremy Grantham has written brilliantly saying that business potentially now exerts dangerous control over the Congress. I'm sure Coca-Cola could achieve anything if the right laws were in place. So my question really for the panel, and indeed for this conference, is how can business partner with government to get the right laws in place?
So before you hand back, are you saying that business is partnering with government in order that the right laws do not get in place, i.e. that there's not aggressive enough legislation in this area? Is that the subtext to your question?
Well, I think everyone in the room would agree we don't have laws that will limit greenhouse gas emissions to a safe level. So there are perhaps 2 reasons why that hasn't happened. One is business lobbying, and I'm just identifying Jeremy Grantham's leading comments on this, but also an invitation for progressive businesses like Coca-Cola and others to find a way to work with government. What would that look like so we can get the laws passed?
So, Mr. Grantham, what do you think on that?
Well, in the US, it's obvious that large corporate blocs pretty well control Congress to a degree they haven't in many recent decades. I gather it was pretty bad back in the 19th century. But now the financial industry controls most of finance, and the hydrocarbon industry controls most of the regulations, making it impossible for the time being to get simple things like a climate change bill, or indeed anything with the long-term well-being of society in its mind. And it doesn't have a prayer for the time being.
Yeah.
Mr. Brock?
I would just say, I think there is some reason for optimism, but not as much as we'd like to see. If you think back 10 years ago, certainly in the world of sustainability, it was very unusual and almost never happened when you'd have business, NGOs, and government sitting down together to talk about issues. And that has dramatically changed. To your question, I think where the biggest progress has actually been made is between businesses and NGOs. I mean, we have coolers, which you'll see at the Olympics, that are now endorsed by Greenpeace because we've actually sat down and talked about what is the objective and how can we get there collectively. We have a major investment through the Coca-Cola system into the World Wildlife Federation. We have actually found that 90% of the NGOs out there and us have the same end objective. We just don't always have quite the same means to the end, and I think that's major progress. I think we need to figure out how to get that same kind of progress, honestly, between businesses, NGOs, and governments, and we haven't figured it out yet.
Admiral Morisetti, you spent a fair amount of time in government. Is business a good partner in creating legislation that has an eye to the environment and resource scarcity?
I think if we take the UK example, we've got some legislation. The challenge is actually delivering against that legislation. And the dialogue piece is absolutely right. You've got to have this dialogue between all those involved, and you've got to speak a language that people feel comfortable with. And if I can use an example, when I started this job in the autumn of 2009, the focus of the UK Ministry of Defence was principally about meeting the government emissions and up for the various phases, and they were called soggy targets, and it's about greening. Now, for most of my fellow military officers and myself probably at that stage, hang on, this constrains our business, it's all wet stuff, we're not interested. You know, let the civil servants sort that out, we'll worry about getting on and fighting the wars and everything. And the reality is, when you start to look at it and say, it's a bit like with the context of the energy piece, where you say, well, actually, there's some real opportunities here. We can be better at fighting, we can make our kit more sustainable, we can reduce our costs, and we can reduce risk, people start to buy it. The challenge you have, and coming back to the targets piece, is, and we've had, again, a discussion about what level of target should we be trying to drive down our fossil fuel usage by, either through energy efficiency or alternative energy. And part of the problem is they need to be targets which will challenge people, but they can't daunt them to the point at which they say, well, I just can't be bothered, or it's not worth doing. They've got to see the advantages and the opportunities, and there has to be a way of bringing back, whether it's resources or whatever, the benefits from doing so. If you take the United States Navy, as they drive down their energy use, some of that money goes back into the central coffers, some of that goes back to the platforms that have driven down the energy use for their own benefit, for the holistic benefit of the ships. So there's lots of ways of doing it. You've got to be innovative, and it does require a partnership, but it means to be talking a common language with something that people feel comfortable about.
Very good. There's a gentleman here.
Thank you. My name is Will Goodlad from Digital Explorer. This session's about knowing the unknowns, and I just wanted to mention one resource and to ask the panel if they had any opinion about it, which we know is running out, but it's just because it's unseen that it seems not to be mentioned here yet. It could have come up in the food session, namely fish, wild ocean fish, which we know we're going to hunt to extinction. We've industrialized the process within possibly 50 years, and that's going to cause a humanitarian disaster for at least 200 million people, and indeed, as the Admiral referred to, a massive increase of security risk. So I was wondering if the panel had any comment on that.
Our foundation spends increasing amount of its money on fishery recovery programs because fish are incredibly fertile. A cod produces 1 to 3 million eggs every year. If you give it half a chance, the populations will come back. That is not true on land, and therefore on land you have to have long horizons, and humans hate long horizons, but fishermen are about as hard to please as anyone on the planet. But when they see their fishing conditions improve that rapidly, they are slowly but surely being cajoled into doing some things. And since I believe the biggest problem that's already in train is food shortage in the poorer countries, fish protein from coastal waters is particularly important for that population. And everything that can be done may turn out to be really critical in the next 30, 40 years.
And sorry, Jeremy, just so I understand, are you saying something that is actually the opposite of what this gentleman was asking, which is it is possible to intervene in fisheries and turn this around so that actually we don't hunt fish to extinction?
Yes, local fisheries where you can take even a fairly small piece and demonstrate how well it works has the potential, and I believe it will actually happen. It will just spread around coastal waters. And locally they will be given an incentive to keep the enemy out. They'll divvy up the shares and they'll protect their own waters. I think there's a huge potential there. Dealing with pelagic or ocean-going fish is a much bigger problem, and you need international agreements. And they've done okay with some of the whales. So the potential exists there, but you've got very intractable, greedy governments. The Spanish government have been deplorable, who scatter their ships all over the planet, destroying the ocean floor, ruining, therefore, for decades, the recovery potential, as well as knocking down the fish to levels where they take a long time to recover.
Neil Morisetti.
I think it's a bit of both, really. You need the programs to regenerate stocks, but you also need the ability to manage the exclusive economic zones, the fishing grounds, to ensure that those who are moving around from other parts of the world trying to deplete stocks because their own have run out for a variety of reasons don't cause a problem. And therefore, countries have to have the capacity to look after their fishing grounds. If they can't do it, then others have got to do it. It doesn't have to necessarily be military forces. But if we don't, then we increase the risk of events like coast of Somalia, where one of the contributing factors, not the only one by a long way, but one of them, is the fact that fishermen were coming in from abroad because their own stocks would be depleted and removing them from those grounds. So it needs all. And it's not just a security issue, it's not just an economic issue, and it's not just a scientific issue. It's all of that, and it needs some form of governance to make sure it happens, whether it's national or international legislation.
I'm going to revert briefly to some of our anonymous callers. These ones are for you, Jeremy Grantham, and they come thick and fast. Would Mr. Grantham buy shares in Coca-Cola Enterprises? Why does Mr. Grantham not highlight water as an investment area that meets all his criteria?
Okay, hang on. I can only...
Oh, sorry, I'll go more slowly.
Coca-Cola, we recommend the great franchise companies because they have the resilience to cope with a lot of adversity. I see the next 20, 30 years particularly dangerous, and therefore, as a stock investor, they look appealing. On a longer horizon, you have to deal with the fact that this is a rather unhealthy beverage, I'm sorry. And that, along with meat and so on, will be necessary eventually to provide the calories to keep the world going. So that's a longer term problem. Water, water is a bit like air, in my opinion. You start messing around with water rights. Yeah, you could do some good capitalist deals, but you better make sure you're doing them in the United States or Canada or New Zealand, because the first thing that happens when the trouble arrives is that they'll nationalize anyone who's gotten in the way of their water, and then their farmland, and if you're Argentina, everything else. Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to put John Brock in an awkward position where he has to do some pointless PR for Coke. So let me just say it's the real thing. The final question then to you was: you seem to be saying that investors should take advantage of resource scarcity to make money and never mind the result. Wouldn't it be better to try to align economic and environmental goals?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. My attitude is, I'm in the investment business. I have to deliver a good 10-year advice and good 5-year advice. I've kind of drawn the line on very short stuff. And honestly, I think resources will make people money. My foundation invests in everything except coal and tar sands. But its attitude is, step one, let's make a lot of money. Step two, let's use that money to save the planet. I think that is the sequence in which one should think.
If there are any further questions, wave now. There you are, you're waving. This will have to be the last one, I'm afraid.
Yes, my name's Camilla Tallman from IID, think tank based in London. I wanted to ask the Admiral about how things are done differently as a consequence of this forward look and intelligence gathering. And I'm thinking in particular of a country like Mali in West Africa that I know well, which, as you will know, has suffered serious political turmoil in the last few months, which I think for many people was rather unexpected, but was in part the consequence of the knock-on from the Libyan campaign and the inflow of a lot of people in arms to the south. I wonder, what is it that happens differently as a result of a forward look that you're making? Are you thinking about consequences for better institution building, better governance?
Thank you.
What's the implication in terms of next steps and action by UK government and Europe more generally, perhaps?
I think, yes, we've got it in a nutshell. What we ought to be trying to do is for countries where they are struggling to have, whether it's their government or their society structure, to have the capacity and resilience to meet the challenges that are affecting them, then we should be focusing assistance, development aid, whatever it be, skills, in order to allow them to have the ability to deal with these issues that they face and the challenges I talked about earlier on. Perhaps what's different now is where we may have in the past said, well, that, in the UK we said that's DFID's business or it's USAID's business or whatever. The reality is it's a wider government business. The scale varying from a military perspective, I think it's very small, but also it's a government, non-government piece, and business or non-government organisations that we need to do it in a more holistic fashion.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we move seamlessly from this session on resource volatility into a session on resource efficiency and shareholder value. And I hope you will see one as the flip side of the other. Please join me, though, in thanking our panel, John Brock, Jeremy Grantham, and Neil Morisetti.